How are you doing? Very well. How are you? No, but I'm whooping up. We're going to Clear Lake for, I got about 6 trips to Clear Lake in the next 3 months. Yeah, it's 68 square miles. I'm never going to find a fisher. He knows somebody like that. It's worth it. It's an investment. My son and I we had 4 bass boats. We did okay, but one day my son's much smarter than I am. I was grousing about back in the boat and then into the garage. I was up front doing all the work. My friend was sitting in the back. He said, "Sell the boat and hire a guy." I have, yes. We for years, when there's a lot of rivers where they won't let you use an engine. The Smith River, classic. I fished there for years with Kevin and Rock, and we fished in a drift boat. If he wanted to keep you in a hot hole, that poor guy had to roll you back up. Oh, well, maybe it can make a good connection. The bunch of kids started high school fishing. And I love it. It was organic. They got themselves a faculty advisor. They're in their 3rd year. Maybe that might be a neat addition to their team.
Tom, did
Yes,
you,
3 o'clock.
so when I do roll call, I'll call your name first.
Yeah, I might hear it.
No, I know.
Last time was out.
Okay. Is anyone,
That's not gonna make it. Yeah, we'll be out.
okay. Does that connect to your phone?
What's that?
Does that connect to your phone?
Yeah, it does. Basically, they hand these out a bottle rocket for you. It's like a food handing them out.
I should have invented that.
Yeah, no, this is a $1 million idea. So it's like my wife runs really hot and one, and she has like 3 or 4 of these laying around the house, so she can plug them in all the time.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
And everybody else.
I guess it's 3 o'clock.
What's that?
It's 3 o'clock.
Yeah.
God, yeah. Yeah. There was an accident like when it was
You know what? I drove by your house today. I drove by your house today.
I'm good. How are you?
Like, we're going to make it. So we shouldn't even thought about it because
I was going to say, I bet.
Oh, there were?
Where? 15
Oh, there are. Oh.
which is where Public Works is. Where what is? Public Works.
So
Oh, that's where you are. Yeah, I've been there. Okay. I was at the fire station. Oh, I've only been here for 4 months. So I didn't really even get it.
No, I think it's about 20 minutes long. So I just had a couple questions for you because I think the most important just want to show us this evening.
And then it went out. Yeah.
So that's kind of been.
So you're this like your 3rd place. Well, hopefully you won't be there too long in that building. How is that building?
It's okay. They put cubicles in there. It's really nice. And my previous job, I worked at the Town Council for 5 years. I was in leadership. I kind of thrive on chaos. Like just people busy.
You like that? You don't find it distracting?
No, and I can't see anything.
So it can kind of sweep you up, and the excitement is productivity.
Yeah. Do you go? Yeah, I have a door behind me. But I'm so busy. I don't usually. Yeah, I should. You have to tell me like where I should go.
I don't know. God, where do I
didn't.
I put the time.
Oh, yeah. George, I'm surprised. I bet you the number's even higher than 30.
What could be? I know it's at least that.
Oh, yeah, but if you were talking only 1 to 2
No, so I not necessarily add.
All right, folks, could we get ready to go here, please?
Yeah, I tried.
Just on your signature.
Hi, how are you? You ready? All right. We'd like to call to order the meeting of the Financing City Civic Infrastructure Task Force meeting. And Ms. Nixon will begin with a roll call, please.
Chair McBroom,
Here.
Vice Chair David, Member Hale, Member Honig, Member Keneally, Member Wallach,
Here.
Member Ward. Let the record be known that Member Keneally is absent.
All right, I have an update from Pat from his committee work, so we'll be able to cover that, hopefully in his absence. Right, item 3 on the agenda is time for public comment. Invite any members of the public who are present to come to the podium and discuss items of interest to the task force. Okay, hearing none. We'll move on to item 4, which is approval of the minutes from our last meeting. I hope everybody's had a chance to review them. Does anybody like to discuss anything or find the minutes in error? Okay, hearing none. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. No, you good? Okay. Then I'm looking for a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting.
I so move.
And a second. Okay. Any opposed? All right. Then the minutes are accepted. There was a meeting last night at the city council meeting, or part of the city council meeting was about our work and the work of the infrastructure options facing the city. And Mr. Presswich, I believe, is prepared to give us a briefing on that meeting.
Thank you, Chair McBroom. We're going to bring up a video to show you some slides from last night. Okay, I'll just jump right into it. So on January 8th, this is rolling through. Did it? Is it just to the right once? Yeah. There we go. Okay, so on January 8th, the council reviewed a number of options that NOLL and TAM had presented, and at that meeting, they were interested in looking at the costs associated with a 2-story joint city hall council chambers. And this is when we first met, I indicated that we had the cost for what a single-story city hall would be, and that's represented on this visual by the 8,500 square foot separate city hall. So in an earlier configuration, that building in a campus setting was to at the corner of Adams and Library Lane, and it was a little larger because it included the Stevenson Museum, and there was a third building in the middle of that campus type setting. So I indicated to you that we knew the cost of an 8,500 square foot building, and that we were waiting to receive information from NOLL and TAM regarding the cost of a joint multi-story joint city hall library building. And so that was really the core focus of last night's presentation. So they shared some visuals of what this would look like. And they also provided a couple of different options just for context. They called them options in the presentation yesterday, but the council, this was really for context. So there were options 4, 5, 6, and 7. And we'll look at these real quick. So this was for context. This was another version. If you took that single 8,500 square foot building and integrated it into the existing library, and then added a multi-purpose building or square footage at the upper right corner of that diagram, and relocated the Stevenson Museum to the front, this is what it would look like, and we have a cost estimate. The total square footage was 25,000 square feet. But the council did not ask specifically for this. This was context. And that's a visual representation of that. Another visual representation. And this is really for scale and massing. And then this is the option that the council was looking for. How does it fit on to the library parcel? Can it fit? In this case, this is a 27,000 square foot building. The city hall portion of that building is about 6,450 square feet, so smaller than the 8,500 square feet, due to efficiencies with shared restrooms, etc. And if you see off to the bottom left, that's a multi-purpose space that could be used by the council for meetings, and by the community. Presentation would include the children's library on the floor, on the ground floor, shared with City Hall, and then the entire second floor would be the library, and the Stevenson Museum would be located on top of that multi-purpose room. So this is a concept. The feedback from the council last night was three of them preferred this option over the standalone separate City Hall. It was a long discussion. They had, I think, all of the council members and some members of the public commented that they might want to pull the building away from the edge of the parcel, essentially moving it to the south a little bit, and think through how the parking might be oriented differently. And so the takeaway was that the building itself versus a three-building campus was $15 million less expensive, and so that was attractive to the council. The cost of this is $38.7 million, and I know there is a subcommittee that's had some intimate conversations, good conversations with NOLL and TAM and their estimator regarding what assumptions they use when they estimate, and would have some additional thinking to share with the full task force on the numbers. So this is a visual representation of that. This is a view looking north out of the second floor. This is the slide. The left side of this slide is the previous concept of a campus with new buildings. Both the City Hall or the library could swap there. So there was a previous discussion about, does the City Hall belong on the south or on the north, etc. And then the combination version that we just saw was really the consolidation of all of that into a single building. So going back one, sorry. That's 33,000 square feet total, which includes a very large multi-purpose room in the middle there. Option 5 was the standalone. In this cost estimate, NOLL and TAM added $3.8 million for what they described as a refresh. And what they did is they assumed $300 a square foot for just simply any type of upgrades that would be desired for the building, including the roof, but primarily interior improvements. And then option 5, I think is the same, right? Is that, yeah, 6? Yeah, on the right is 6. This is the combination, so 25,000 square feet, a smaller City Hall because there are economies of scale and efficiencies with the shared restrooms, etc. But this was really for context purposes, not truly an option being considered because it had been reviewed and discussed prior. And then option 7 in contrast to 6. And that's the reference to the 6,455 square feet of City Hall. And then here are the numbers. So this is a summary of all of that. On the bottom right are some of the efficiencies that are gained through that combination, or really these are the efficiencies gained through option 7 on the new combined structure. Just going back there for a second, the lobby is smaller on that option. There would be shared meeting rooms, shared restrooms, shared staff support spaces. So is that a break room that everyone in the building can share rather than having multiple break rooms in different buildings? Reduced circulation, so fewer hallways and fewer mechanical spaces. And we've talked about this before in terms of how they calculated their soft costs. This is a summary tab of all of those. The real takeaway last night was the cost associated with option 7, $38.7 million, as well, and that does not include any escalation. That's today's number. And the other takeaway was the discussion that the council had regarding their preferences for essentially option 5, which has the standalone city hall with some modest investment in the library, and its contrast with option 7, the combination new building. And again, with a 3-2 vote, the council expressed a preference for option 7 and wanted to be sure that this committee and task force that this was communicated to you today. Happy to answer any additional questions you have.
The only thing that I would add was that the council was quite convinced that the work of the task force was going to be the key to helping them make a decision on where to go here. So they're counting on us being able to spell out for them what the financial options are and what they need to do to get to a $39 million number, and whether or not they agree to do that. So was anybody else watch the meeting or have comments on the meeting? Thanks, Mark. Go ahead.
And I guess one last thing is they do view option 5 as a realistic option.
Right.
They didn't express a lot of interest necessarily in option 6, for example, which was shown for context purposes, but they do realistically acknowledge that a standalone city hall, whether it's there or somewhere else, is essentially an option that is realistic to them.
Yeah, in fact, we talked about that as being a base case option, where really the current situation of City Hall being scattered over several temporary spaces really isn't a realistic option. So building a 8,500 square foot City Hall building becomes part of the base case. It's what you've got to do along with the other infrastructure needs of the city, such as the storm sewers and the other things we've been looking at.
Just so I'm making sure that I understand, so it's 17 option 5 is 17.5, and of that 3.8.
I have some more figures on that. I'll help you clarify that.
Renovating the library, so that means that building costs X.
Well, option 5 as presented included $3.8 million for the library, and we're not convinced that that is the lowest you can go. There is a option to spend, I think we've decided, about $1 million in the library to extend its life, which would include a new roof and some work on HVAC and some other miscellaneous things. So there is I think the minimum option, and we'll get to that, would include $1 million for the library. It would include, I'm not quite ready to go there yet, but it would include whatever the option 5 is for the City Hall, and of course the police station, which we haven't talked about the police station, but we have to eventually include it. Any other comments on the meeting? Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, if I could just, the library folks were at the meeting last night, and they pointed out too that they're also in the course of doing a program update study, which will better define even what their goals and needs are. That's not completed yet, but I think is on its way. Whether it gets it's something that we could fold in or not, I'm not sure. But also pointed out just some sort of synergy issues that they have, or with access and having this library on the second floor. Just to kind of express that as a concern. But
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the library people seemed supportive of getting a brand new library, and I think that the library being only in a conceptual stage now gives them the opportunity to blend in whatever program work they have to contribute. So I didn't see that as inconsistent. Anything else on the?
Yeah, just on the option 5 lowest cost alternative. I've spent quite a bit of time digging through the library lately trying to understand the EMG report, which went over 51 deficiencies that needed to be fixed at some point in time. The $1 million won't cover much of that. So that's a discussion we'll need to have at some point, not now, because it's not like, you know, is it 1 million or 3 million or is it 2? We can deal with those issues later. But the concern I have is there's been a lot of deferred maintenance, and $1 million won't cover that if we expect to pick up. So that's a decision we need to make down the road. But when you're looking at option 5 versus 7, it's not that important at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on the board work from last night? Council.
Is there, if this new library, you know, is built, what happens to the library during that period of time when this is being built? Did they offer any suggestions on that?
That didn't come up last night, but I'm sure Mark has some background on
that would fall on my shoulders a little bit, and we have thought through different issues related to phasing and relocation, and I think the short answer is we would need to downsize the stacks substantially. We would likely move back into the Carnegie building for a period of time, and because we're part of a partnership series with the libraries in the region, we can still find people books. It just may take a day or two to get those books, and they would go into that broader circulation and or storage. But there are some interesting concepts, such as taking the children's library and working with a school district to potentially move if that was a requirement, if we were planning a new building or a substantial upgrade to the building and the staff needed to move out, we might want to work with a school district to relocate the children's library to a school campus, maybe across the street from the Carnegie, and then the main library at the Carnegie, but with a smaller stack size for a period of time, and then presumably about 2 years later move back into a new building or a refurbished building.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Is there anything else? Okay, we'll move on to the committee reports. I would start by saying that we had planned as a task force to be at the stage where during the next 2 weeks we should be able to be coming to final numbers and being able to run some final options. We had planned at this point to be at rough numbers, and in 2 weeks' time to have the options fully vetted and ready to roll. So with that, we'll move on to the Finance Committee, and Pat asked me to give you some of the notes on where the committee is. They are in version 3 of their model, which is a worksheet model to try to balance the revenue need, or the revenue needs to serve the cost options. In other words, the facility options that are going to be fully vetted in the model, and be able to select from those, and then select finance options that might be available to fund those. So the model is basically ready to go. They're trying to finalize the figures, the basic figures, and that would include discussion on the unfunded CIP, the storm sewer budgets, and the streetscape. So I, as part of the construction committee, was also working with the city to get final estimates for those. The ones we're operating now with would be $500,000 a year for the storm sewer for a 10-year period. And we think that the phase 1 of the streetscape is fully funded by a grant and by Measure T funds, including, I think, the overrun in phase 1 cost funded by incremental borrowing against future Measure T. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mike. I think that's right. And we think that between phase 2, which is the bulb out of the streetscape, probably we funded a combination of Measure T and Caltrans, state highway funding. So they're ready at that point with those inputs that we finalized with the city this week. The Finance Committee is ready to start running the cost options for development and the finance options. We did have a discussion this week with the city's consultant for borrowing, for city bonding, for borrowing through bonds. The estimate, and correct me, Glenn, I think the max estimate at this point is somewhere shy of $10 million in borrowing capacity.
$79 million based upon current assets.
So those of you can hear that, about $9 billion borrowing capacity, which is significant, but it's not enough to carry some of the options that we have on the table. They have yet to vet that out, as well as the public-private partnership options, which we're still trying to flesh out too. But that should be resolved within a week's time. Any questions on the finance update? I'm sorry, Pat couldn't make it. Real estate development.
The way we're kind of approaching this, we've kind of divided all the areas into kind of site files. They're all basically compiled and coming into kind of better focus. And kind of each site kind of examines current state and uses and then value, and then kind of configures those sites in the current and then alternate solutions and ways that they can best serve sort of the entire ecosystem. The goal, or the way we're approaching this, is you kind of creating kind of a scaffold that addresses all the pieces can plug in. And if you say pursue solution A at this site, it frees site B, to serve some other critical infrastructure need, and then kind of factors other options. If you build this here, it would have this effect. Whether it degrades the value of this asset in this certain way, or some other solutions will force a search, sort of a real estate or a site search for a temporary solution for, for instance, the library or the combo issue, or solution would we'd present a reasonable way that you could, what kind of capacity is out there to house the library. We're pretty confident we'll have within about a week's time all these numbers. We can kind of fold the extra layers in and have those kind of for distribution. So in about a week's time. So.
Any questions on the real estate report? Okay. All right, construction. We had a few things to do this past couple of weeks, and one of which was to talk to NOLL and TAM about their program estimates and their construction estimates. And as Mark said, we were the group that met with them. That was Dan and Richard and myself. We wanted to first talk about their space estimates. Their 8,500 square feet, for instance, for the standalone City Hall was not just based on what the departments are using now. I mean, that is what they're using now, but the NOLL and TAM looked at number of personnel, they looked at conference rooms, bathrooms, lobby area, and were able to validate the need for 8,500, and it seemed reasonable to the subcommittee, I think. As you go to other options, the City Hall gets smaller because of the efficiencies of combining functions with the library. But we were comfortable with the 8,500 square feet, understanding that's conceptual only. When we go to final design, there'll be a more detailed programming effort, and that may change slightly, but probably not much. Cost. All right, so NOLL and TAM, with their cost estimator, does a very detailed breakdown of building costs. It's really a bottoms-up kind of estimate, starting with the very small detail, construction details. Things like framing, glass area, roof, all based on square footage estimates off the conceptual design times whatever the unit cost they're seeing in current bids, current and recent projects. So it's a very bottoms-up approach. It all, of course, is based on the unit cost. What do they assume in terms of dollars per square foot for framing, for instance, or glass? I mean, it's based on recent projects, but it is subjected to some judgment on their part of what we would run into here. But it all is very objectively put together in terms of the quantities, the cost per square foot, all builds up into some number. So it's very careful, very methodical. But being a skeptic, I guess I would say that they're in the business of supplying building estimates to cities who must then go get allocations for money. And I don't think they'd be in business very long if they underestimated building costs. So I would suggest that if it's subjective, these are probably a little heavy, but I wouldn't dare to venture a guess on how much. I think these are fair enough. Also, it should be understood that there are contingencies in these numbers. There's a 20% design contingency, for instance, in the numbers, which means that if the final design is different than the conceptual design, it could move the numbers as much as 20%. That's in the building cost. And in the soft cost, there's also a 10% construction contingency. So there's a fair amount of contingency is in the numbers. That's normal in construction. I wouldn't expect to see anything different. But the task force and the community should know that these numbers should be adequate. Is there anything that, Dan, did you and Richard have anything to add to that?
I would just, and we talked about this with NOLL and TAM. You know, obviously the numbers can get less fuzzy, more informative the more detailed the program and the requirements and the parameters of what you're asking them to do are. You know, so I think the good lesson for City Council would, and moving forward, would be the more you can define what you're asking for, the more reliable those numbers are going to be, and the more surety that even their estimators will have in them. You know, I think they're kind of not surprisingly rangy at this point, and I think a lot of that math may change if the assumptions of scale are you have that hard conversation. I think obviously the more you build, the less per square foot it's going to be just on its face, not addressing what kind of building, but I think what we would want to push for is just a more defined scope. You know, that's going to deliver a much more useful set of numbers.
So I was quite impressed with their estimating. I used to do this for a living, and it is the level of detail that's necessary at this point, and it is backed up by seven different recent constructions that NOLL and TAM either did or had the information from. And so they took, unit cost of dollars per square foot of floor, ceiling, roof, etc. The overall average cost of those 7 buildings that they gave us was $900 a square foot, which matches the numbers in the presentation. So they were able to back up their detailed estimate with actual recent bids. So my view is option 5 and 7 are good to go. We always will refine things as we learn more. Particularly option 5, the $300 a square foot, doesn't have any scope. So if we were to need to go back to option 5, we would need to prepare what exactly are we going to remodel and what are we going to leave alone with the building. But the 17.8 or whatever it is million is, in my view, good to go for our analysis.
I think that's the judgment of the subcommittee, that I think these will be adequate. I don't think we'll be surprised by bids coming in over, but it's reasonable to use them now for planning purposes. To get to the actual numbers, as Richard just mentioned, the base case City Hall number is $8.8 million with soft cost, which is $900 a foot construction cost and a 30% of project soft cost, which includes a 10% contingency. So the soft cost, in other words, is 20% is for design and other soft cost, 10% is for construction contingency. The library in the base case, we're circling around a $1 million number for the base case. NOLL and TAM had suggested 3.8. Has been discussed to do a real minor facelift on the project, but we're thinking, if you're really looking base case, what do you really need to spend in the library to keep it going for another 20 years? We'd like to suggest we start with $1 million. And the police station, which we haven't really talked about with NOLL and TAM, I think we've estimated it at 5,000 square feet. I haven't seen any space planning on that, but is that a number that's, Mark, is good for planning purposes?
I'm using 4,500 as a placeholder. I think somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 may be adequate. But when I did the math on 4,500, I believe that calced just short of $6 million at $1,000 a square foot.
Yeah, I did the math at 5,000, and it comes out around 6.4 million. So the $6 million number would be right. That is at the same construction cost per foot as the City Hall, which is largely office space. We've determined the jail does not need holding cells, does not need sally port or any special security arrangements. So the construction cost is basically office space. It's similar in construction to that of City Hall. Fair enough. Scheme 7, which Mark presented, of course, I don't go through that too much, but it's the 38.7 million, plus you have to add in the police station for another 6 million.
So just so I'm clear, so in the 2-story building, the police station is not included in that. It's separate. Was there ever a thought of including it?
The NOLL and TAM work, if that's what you're referring to, has not involved any estimates or programming for the police station.
Okay.
And if I could just comment on that, our preference would be to separate the building for a couple of reasons. It preserves service delivery options for the city, for one reason. Second reason is the tracks. and the location of the library present some potential challenges with response if there happened to be a train in the way at the time that the response was needed, if they weren't if they were in quarters. And so those are two reasons at the moment that drive a recommendation to separate the buildings. It doesn't mean that they can't be combined, but there are some concerns that we have regarding putting them together.
Thank you. Are there any other? The one other number that the subcommittee discussed with NOLL and TAM was underground parking and the cost of that, because there are some schemes that we're looking at for development that would include underground parking, and it is not cheap. So a fully underground stall cost, according to NOLL and TAM, $97,000 per space.
Quick
So,
question.
to give you some idea, a 50 space underground parking would then run roughly $5 million. A 100 space would be close to 9.7 million, so it's not insignificant. There is an option where you can do partial underground parking, where there is some daylight available to the structure that's not, so you don't need the same level of ventilation and lighting, etc., which is about $44,000 a space. So as we're looking at various options, and some may require underground parking, we do have what we think is a reliable number for that.
And I'm sorry, what was that number again per space? 40?
44 for partial, 97 for fully underground.
Are all of these fundamentally turnkey? Are they inclusive of FF&E?
They do include FF&E. Yep, they include all.
So this is truly turnkey.
Okay.
Well, FF&E phones. I think there's electronics, phone. I don't know if it includes all the office equipment. Like, does it include computers and?
I don't recall that particular part of the discussion, but I think you covered that in your telephone call with them, and I thought the answer was yes. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm looking at the FF&E assumptions, and it is furniture, fixtures, and equipment, which of course is FF&E, security equipment, AV, telecommunications. So yes, I'd say it's either turnkey or close to it.
Okay. I have a quick question about parking. When you mentioned the parking, have we looked at like what it would be to restripe Library Lane and turn, adjust?
We talked about that.
Uh-huh.
And we
Mike.
Mike.
We've actually kind of talked on the construction side and the development side, just because there's kind of two different considerations, I think, because the Library Lane is quite wide, or apparently is very wide, and the parking that's alongside is very inefficient. From both, I think, construction and the other side, if you were to turn them perpendicular, you could. We have the numbers.
Probably double the
someplace.
numbers or something.
Yeah, I mean the current library parking is large and pretty severely underutilized. I mean, there's 12 spaces on the parcel itself. On the north side, there's 10,000 or so square feet in that zone, which is, it would be in the view shed of the library, but that whole side of the library is wall anyway.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it's certainly something that will come out on, I think, on both the development side as a consideration and different kind of solution, and makes, I think, probably automatically just more sense than sticking it in the vineyard or in that.
I think anytime we can pave, less with asphalt, and both from an expense and sort of just a way of living, shoot, we got all this asphalt, why not just be more efficient with what we got?
Obviously, perpendicular parking, we're going to get a lot more spaces. Spaces.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments on the construction report? The editorial committee is, which is Patton and me at the moment, have just started to sketch out what a report might look like but we haven't really begun writing anything yet. I think that will come very soon, probably in the next 2 weeks or so. Okay, item 7. Do we have information or documents we need from the city?
Do you want to take public comment on the subcommittee reports?
Sure.
In case there is any.
Open the mic to public comment on anybody that would like to comment on the subcommittee reports before we wrap that up.
I just have a question. With that parking, is that for staff and?
I'm sorry, could you please step to the podium?
Hi. With the parking that you're considering, how much of that is for public parking and how much is staff parking? For, you know, I mean, to accommodate, for example, if City Hall is there in the library and whatnot, certain amount of that would be for them, and then how much more would be for public?
Mark, would you like to comment? I'm not quite sure.
In the rendering for option 7, there aren't a lot of parking spots there, and I tend to have a philosophy that I would want our staff to, if that was the only amount of parking that was available in a construction in a constructed building, I would want our staff to park elsewhere and walk to the building and allow those spaces for customers. I think it's too early to know how many parking spots would be required or built for any of the configurations, and so. But I would just say that if there are a limited number of parking spots, we will work on ways that our staff has an ability to park in other locations. In City Hall, we will have approximately 23 staff members, give or take. Maybe I might be short a couple. And then the library would be potentially an extra 7 or so at any one time. So we may need about 30, up to 30. At the same time, I say that we are encouraging carpooling and other forms of transportation to and from work. So we hope not to have that much of an influence on the parking spaces.
So I'd say to answer your question, I think at the moment they haven't designated employee versus public parking yet. There are certainly street options, as Dan had mentioned, on Library Lane. To plenty of parking and more parking could be accommodated by different configuration. And in the basic design 5 that Mark presented, that building can actually be any number of places, and I think the number of parking is sort of unique to the site. So that probably is going to have to be resolved in the next stage of design, when we actually start identifying sites. Dan?
Yeah, I would just, on the parking, I think we also should be aware that each, whichever solution, potentially has different parking requirements for the same facility, depending where it's located, because there's going to be different synergies with other things, different effects of those relationships, and each, even just by code, the different sites have different parking requirements of what's required and what's kind of readily available in the vicinity. That some solutions in one place will be more connective and require in actual use less parking and will be more accessible via pedestrian connectivity, which I think is a factor that we certainly should consider, not as a task force, but just as a citizen. So.
Any more on that topic or any other topic before we move on? Okay, hearing none. Talk about number 7, discussion or review of documents and information requests. We are at the stage in our work where we need to finalize estimates on infrastructure costs that the city is facing other than City Hall and Library. So we're finalizing costs for storm sewer repair, for the streetscape, numbers that the city and the task force agree are realistic and will not change. And we don't want to have two different sets of facts here. We want one set of facts. So we're at the stage within the next few days, I think we can finalize that. Are there any other requests? I know that we are going to need considerable city time to discuss these options as they start unfolding, which I think is going to be in the next 2 weeks. I expect the cost options to be finalized, and I expect the development options to be at the point where we can start looking at those and weighing one option against the other, and that is going to require some of the city manager's time, perhaps some of the finance department's time. And I would just, I guess, give a heads up that that's where we're headed. We're at that stage. Any other comments from the?
One question. I assume Phase 3 of Streetscape is out of our review scope. Is that correct?
Yeah, I didn't talk that, yes, but Mark can comment more. But the feeling is that Phase 3 of Streetscape can be accomplished through other means, through normal development as those areas are developed, and the city's through its change in standards on what it's going to require for sidewalk curbs. Mark?
And it doesn't mean that you can't provide options or recommendations related to funding for Phase 3. It's a much larger number than Phase 2, so it does present some challenges for us to deliver that.
I think the task force is moving forward with the assumption that that price at them is zero, that it will be funded through other sources or accomplished in other ways. I mean, clearly, if there's further development downstream and there's money available to do it, we could consider it. But I think the feeling of the Public Works Director was that she would not request the allocation of funds from the general fund, at least, to do it. Fair? All right. Are there any other requests for information or documentation that are upcoming? Agenda items for the 2-week meeting 2 week hence. I would assume we're going to want committee reports. The question is, are we going to be ready to talk about real options here?
Based on our timeline, I suspect we have little choice.
So I echo that. So I think within 2 weeks' time, if we want to finish this thing on time, we better start looking at real options. That if we're going to do option 7 scheme on the design, we have to have some ideas on how we're going to raise $39 million. And we have to have a pretty good idea of how we're going to cover the base case. And I would so hope that we would have some pretty firm idea to present those 2 weeks hence, or at least have met with the city to make sure that we're on the same wavelength on what those findings are. Dan?
I mean, I would think I think it's pretty critical that we that the next version of our committee reports is a little meatier outlay, or a little more has a little more heft to it, and has some actual numbers and schemes and kind of begins to shape the narrative, looking at these different pieces.
I would ask Ms. Nixon or Mr. Prestwich about the timing that we would, if we were going to present actual schemes, numbers, plans, those I think would have to be prepared in time for distribution ahead of the meeting. Could you comment on that, please?
Our preference is that we publish about a week in advance. By law, we have to publish 72 hours in advance. So we would endeavor to publish the preceding Wednesday, if possible. It may need to slip to a Friday, but I think that should work for everyone with a Wednesday meeting. Gives you still several days to review. part of the publication date is also intended to provide not only you an opportunity to review, but the public ample opportunity to review material. And in terms of meeting schedule, if you needed an extra meeting to extend this by a couple of weeks, I don't think that's a problem. The council meeting in April, those meetings will be held on the 14th and the 28th. So we can begin to eye a date that you may present to council. I also imagine that from a next agenda item standpoint, we may want to work with the budget committee to bring you some early assumptions regarding long-range financial forecasting, share a preliminary version of what that looks like, receive some feedback, talk about some of the other ways we might run a scenario on the long-range financial forecast, and make sure that the task force feels comfortable with the various approaches that we're modeling.
Yes, thank you. Agreed. Richard.
Yeah, I've got one other question. So I'm on the construction committee, but if we decide that one of the alternates we're going to look at is 3P, public-private partnership, there's multiple ways that can evolve. One of them is called DBFOM, Design, Build, Finance, Operate, and Maintain. So I guess I had looked at the presentations that we had received previously. It was a 64-page document, but it covered much larger projects. And so I guess the Finance Committee's looking into it. My concern is, what is the track record of 3P for projects of this dollar size? There wasn't any information in what we've read to date, so I'm concerned that most of those projects got tied to a development that the city facility might be part of, but but many of them had a source of income coming from a building on joint land. So I would like an update, if we're looking at 3P, on where that stands and how the contracting might go. I think we would need that in order to understand.
The city has provided a contact through a consultant who they use on, and so we are just reaching out to them and beginning to understand whether a 3P approach does work in this case, and how it would work, and does it make sense, et cetera. If you're going to get to a $39 million number, you're going to have to do something out of the ordinary, and 3P is definitely on the table. Now, whether it works or not, I don't know. We certainly need to up our game on it, though. Glenn, do you have any?
I think it's very right. We had a conversation with
Can you
Dan
speak at the
Nascarello.
Can you speak
Right.
at the mic, please?
Glenn is a expert advisor to the task force in the area of finance.
Yeah, so myself and Tom Allen, who's also a subject matter expert on the finance side, and George had a conversation with Dan Massarella, who works for Cosmont, and he's actually advised the city on this topic before in a number of other different areas. So we got some preliminary information from him yesterday about P3s. They do have a very limited track record in California at this point. They're pretty much in their infancy, especially for cities our size. The projects that they have listed in the documentation you saw is generally for much larger projects. So I'm not sure how applicable it's going to be to St. Helena in particular. They gave us an example of the Oxnard Fire Department, but that's a one-off type of situation. So this is not really a prevalent way of financing right now. And even the use of a P3 would require us to have some sort of revenue stream to fund the P3. So it still boils down to, a requisite revenue source in order to fund a P3 if we want that option.
Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. So I think fair to say the Finance Subcommittee will more thoroughly vet that option as we go, but it definitely is on the table. Okay. Do you think that the Finance Subcommittee would be in a position to report back in 2 weeks about that option?
On the P3, yes.
Okay, he's not on the mic, but the answer is yes.
Quick question. I'm not sure who it directs to, but just in terms of format for prepping these committee reports next time, what format should they be in? Because I'm assuming they'd have to be transmittable onto the screens.
A PDF or a PowerPoint would be fine for us, and
Okay.
we don't need to put it into any special format. So any way you would like to prepare it, we're happy to use
Okay.
that.
My only caution is that we want to make sure that before we start presenting any final solutions, we've had a chance to vet them with all the appropriate folks. Okay. Is there anything else, any other recommendations for the agenda for next meeting? Is hearing none, I will ask for a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Second done. Well, thanks, y'all.